Hi, my name is Daniela Tolchinsky. I'm a graduate student at the Hebrew University in the Department of Political Science, and today I'll be presenting a working paper called Cultural Group Agency. This paper argues that transitional justice, the justice mechanisms that take place after a period of atrocity, limit justice to justice as non-evil, justice as non-injustice. And that if we're interested in pursuit of justice that is greater than or different than what transitional justice allows for, we first need a different moral framework than that which transitional justice creates. I argue that cultural group agency could be that different moral framework. So I present here my understanding of cultural group agency, then the moral significance of this understanding of cultural group agency, and then I turn back and contrast my understanding of the moral framework created by cultural group agency versus that of transitional justice. So the understanding of transitional justice and its moral framework that I'm working with here was first put forth by Robert Meister in his book, After Evil, A Politics of Human Rights. The core categories according to which the transitional justice framework functions are that of the victim, the beneficiary, and the perpetrator. Transitional justice aims at creating a moral consensus, first and foremost, about the past. The beneficiaries, those who benefited from the past regime, tacitly approved of the evil that they benefited from during the period of atrocities. Today, in the period of transition, they must demonstrate that they now acknowledge that that past system was wrong, that the past was in fact evil, even if they didn't see it then. Victims, for their part, must agree not to go in search of retribution going forward, to be reconciled to the idea that this universal moral acknowledgement of their suffering, that the past was in fact evil, that's enough. So in essence, they agree to put evil, defined here as a continuation of violence, into the past. That moral consensus that the past was evil and that evil will now be put into the past is transitional justice's true goal. And as a consequence of it, beneficiaries are allowed to keep their unjustly won gains going forward. There are three core characteristics of the moral framework created by transitional justice, which I won't go into too much detail about here, but they are that transitional justice decollectivizes guilt. It identifies specific perpetrators who committed specific crimes, such that the whole rest of society gets to see themselves and the whole rest of society gets to see them as innocent. Stories of pain and specifically physical pain are centered by a transitional justice process, so that beneficiaries, those who did not suffer at the hands of the evil regime, may identify with and feel compassion for and learn from victims' stories of suffering. Physical pain is much easier to identify with than social or historical pain. As a result of all this, justice gets to be defined as closure, as non-evil. So long as we, going forward, feel compassion for victims who suffer, we all can agree that we will not commit evil again, that we will prioritize non-injustice from now on. So in this way, victim suffering takes on universal moral meaning. It teaches a universal moral lesson to the whole rest of society. Important to note here is that social and historical victims are largely left out of the story. And like I said, beneficiaries are allowed to keep their unjustly won gains. So the question arises of whether this story of transitional justice is justice enough. And if it's not, then what kind of conditions could we create to pursue something different? My argument is that cultural group agency could put forth a moral framework that creates that something different. Now, group agency can be justified in a whole host of ways that I won't go into here. In this paper, I'm relying largely on the work of Deborah Tollefson and her colleague Sean Gallagher in arguing that group agency is justified by the notion of intersubjective processes or characterized by such processes. Cultural group agency, Tollefson and Gallagher argue, does three things for group agents. It establishes their identity, it creates group stability, and it allows for the attribution of agency. It creates for group identity because narratives are the interpretation or integration of collective experiences or collective memories into what defines the group going forward. Narratives create group stability because, particularly with cultural groups, but with group agents more broadly, membership as well as geographic location can shift and meld over time. Narratives are that which is consistent, that which bridges the gaps between varied memberships and varied locations over time. Narratives also enable us to attribute agency to groups, and here specifically to cultural groups, insofar as we reflect on a group action and are able to see the ways in which it is consistent with the group narrative. Now, the flip side of this coin is that as groups plan collective actions going forward, insofar as such intentions or such plans for action are consistent with the group narrative, we may attribute agency to that group. So these qualities, I argue, are distinctly applicable to cultural groups as the type of group that I'm talking about here. This is consistent with the literature on cultural groups, particularly multiculturalism, in terms of how it thinks about what a cultural group is, but I don't have time to go too deep into that today. None of this precludes, I must say, intra-group disagreement surrounding narrative. It is not at all necessary, nor is it typical, for there to be universal consensus or universal understanding among all group members of what the group narrative is or what it means. And yet, group narratives are still able to yield identity, stability, and agency for groups. So a question then arises of how that is. Now, how that is, I believe, is rooted in a particular understanding of what a group agent is. So here again, I'm relying on the work of Deborah Tolchinsky, who argues that the mind can extend to encompass other minds. Here she's relying on the work of cognitive scientists who argue that the mind does not exist solely within the head, but rather encompasses external objects outside the body, insofar as those objects are part of helping an agent, a person, perform cognitive functions in a consistent way. So Tolchinsky argues that perhaps if the mind can extend to external objects, it may also be able to extend to external individuals, to other people. And when this happens, collective systems are formed who can perform actions such as transactive memory, instances in which perhaps a particular individual within a group is responsible for storing or for retrieving memories, and there is consensus or an understanding among members of the group that that is where the memory is located, and that is what that individual is responsible for. In this way, collective cognitive functions are performed via intersubjective processes through these collective systems. And when this happens, we can see that collectives or groups' mental states arise among members, including the space in between them, as information, as beliefs, as memories pass back and forth. And it is these specific processes that form group narratives, that generate group narratives. So if we are to understand cultural group agents as constitutive of these kinds of cognitive processes, and those processes are the ones by which narratives are formed, then it is no surprise that narratives generate group identity, stability, and agency, because groups themselves are identifiable by their capacity to form collective systems and to perform these cognitive processes. So far, I've laid out my understanding of transitional justice and the system that follows, as well as my understanding of cultural group agency. But if we are to look for a moral framework within the idea of cultural group agency, we have to turn to the moral significance of conceiving of cultural groups as group agents. In order to explore that, I argue, we need to turn to the individual experience as part of a cultural group agent, which I argue is characterized by two core qualities. The first is that members will have irreducible group-based reasons for acting, and the second is that members will experience the group's agency as an extension of their own agency. Now, this first quality is not necessarily controversial in the literature on collective intentionality or group agency. The notion that an individual may be motivated to act solely or irreducibly for group-based reasons is widely understood. However, here, my understanding of those group-based reasons is that an individual would be motivated to act based on their understanding of the group narrative. Now, you'll remember a moment ago I mentioned that there is not necessarily universal consensus within a group about what a group narrative is, what it demands of its members, or what it means. So this necessarily means that not all members are going to act in the same way based on their interpretation of the narrative. However, if an individual's action is performed for group narrative-based reasons, it will be performed in the hope or with the expectation that other members will reflect on the narrative, understand it the same way, feel the same demands, and prospectively act similarly. The second quality of an individual's experience as part of a cultural group agent is that the individual, this member, will feel that the group's agency is an extension of their own agency. Now, by this, I do not mean that the individual member will see other members' agency as an extension of their own agency, but rather I mean that the member's response to an instance of collective action will be oriented towards the group as a whole. Again, not towards other particular members, but rather towards the group as a whole. So a quality that I believe captures this idea is that statement that I believe captures this idea is that the acts and emotional responses of the group will be seen as a member's will being done on a stage larger than that on which she acts alone. So even as much as this idea might be relatively intuitive, I would add to this that it is not necessary that a particular member have participated in the collective action in order to react to it in the way that I've described here. So you can think, for example, of a group member, a member of a cultural group agent, and that cultural group agent planned the following day to perform a protest towards a goal that is consistent with this cultural group's narrative. However, our particular member wakes up the next day and feels sick and is unable to attend the protest. She may watch it on TV, she may see it walk by out her window, however, she does not attend. Now, should that protest achieve the goal that this member also hoped to achieve based on her understanding of the group narrative, that member will still see the act, that protest, as her will being done on a stage larger than that on which she acts alone. She may still use the first person plural we in describing what happened in that action. She may say we did it insofar as that action was successful. So if these are the two qualities that I argue characterize an individual member's experience as part of a group agent, it's important to note that non-members do not have these experiences available to them. Here we have a fundamentally different experience for members versus non-members. Non-members of a cultural group agent may still want that cultural group to have particular feelings, to have particular beliefs, to take on particular actions. However, the experiences available to that member or the ways in which that member acts in order to achieve that goal are fundamentally different than those of members of the group. So far I've articulated the understanding of transitional justice that my argument rests upon. I've articulated my understanding of cultural group agents and a bit about the moral significance of cultural group agents understood as such. So if all this is to be taken as true, then what are the implications of cultural group agency, and how is the moral framework that it puts forth different than that of transitional justice? Well, cultural group agency, as I've described it, circumvents the decollectivization of guilt and the universalization of stories of victimhood. I argue that cultural group agency enables us to create a distinction between beneficiaries and social and historical victims. You'll remember from the beginning of this presentation that transitional justice is all about creating a distinction between beneficiaries and perpetrators, as well as creating a distinction highlighting the stories of physical victims so that all may be joined together in a single universal moral consensus about the meaning of the past and what is to be learned from the past. Now, as I said at the beginning, social and historical victims are largely left out of this story because their suffering is systemic. It is much harder for beneficiaries to identify with and therefore not as useful in creating that moral consensus. So cultural group agency, I argue, allows social and historical victims to re-enter the story of justice and link with physical victims in a way that excludes beneficiaries from their agential unit. So as a consequence of distinguishing between beneficiaries and social and historical victims, which transition had aimed to lump together under a single universal moral consensus, social and historical victims gain the conceptual tools to generate their own narrative regarding the meaning of the past, a point that I'll expand more on in a moment. I would like to briefly say that this also allows for beneficiaries to be conceptually reunified with physical perpetrators, a notion that breaks open the idea of collective responsibility, an idea that I think is beyond the scope of this paper, but is important to note is a potential consequence of my argument. So as I said, social and historical groups here gain the conceptual tools to generate their own narrative regarding the meaning of the past in a way that's fundamentally different from the story of transitional justice. Transitional justice argues that the only moral lesson to be learned from a history of atrocity is that non-evil or not committing violence against each other is paramount, and that this understanding of the past is actively constructed for beneficiaries' benefit. It allows them to keep their unjustly won gains. And furthermore, the process by which the events of the past could be narrativized or retold differently is blocked by transitional justice, by the fact that a universal moral meaning is to be taken from the past. So my argument is that the tools of a theory of cultural group agency, the tools that it provides, are those necessary for a cultural group to reconstruct its own moral narrative about the past, in which a clear and unique understanding of that past and potentially where to go in the future may be agreed upon by those who are part of the same socio-historical categories. I would say that transitional justice presupposes groups' inability to both stay true to or to generate their own narrative of the past and still find mutually agreeable terms according to which all groups can live together without killing each other. Cultural group agency, as I've shown, fundamentally rejects that premise. And in that sense, I believe it is a moral framework according to which both are possible, both staying true to and generating one's group's own narrative about the past, as well as finding mutually agreeable terms according to which we can all live together. And for this reason, I believe it is a conceptual or moral framework according to which a break with transition may be possible. So in conclusion, what I've done in this paper is I've put forth and I've demonstrated the moral framework according to which transitional justice operates, characterized by a prioritization of non-injustice, which then allows beneficiaries to keep their unjustly won gains. And I believe that in order to achieve or even take seriously any broader or different conception of justice, a different moral framework is first necessary. Cultural group agency, I argue, is that different moral framework, and it specifically allows us to rid us of the decollectivization of guilt, the universalization of victimhood that characterized transitional justice, thereby allowing each group to narrativize its own collective experiences and shape a different future going forward.